Okay, so if there's anyone in the room, I think this audience probably knows why gender is important in agriculture and under climate change. So, but for anybody that's kind of new to this topic, I thought I'd say 2 sentences about it to get us started. So, what is farming under climate change? Well, we really perceive this as both current climate variability that farmers are experiencing. When we go to the field, we often hear almost every time that weather patterns are changing, they don't know when the rains are going to start, all of these issues that farmers are currently facing. But we're also thinking about future climate change. And both of these things really increase the risk and uncertainty associated with agricultural production. And as we all know, farming is already a risky business. So these kind of impacts are really changing or really increasing those risks and uncertainty for farmers. And then what does gender have to do with this? So we all know that there's existing gender inequalities. The FAO State of Agriculture report a couple of years ago really went into a great detail about some of these inequalities we're seeing between men and women in agriculture. And the thing is that these inequalities already affect women's, and even men's in some cases, ability to adapt to climate change. So it's really important that we really start to understand how we can close these gender gaps and help both women and men farmers adapt to climate change. So today, Jackie and I decided to focus our presentation on busting some of the gender and agriculture myths under climate change. And there's been a lot of work in this area recently. We've seen some colleagues from around the CGIAR working to deal with these zombie statistics or these killer facts, these zombie statistics that just won't die, such as women own less than 2% of the land, and there's also some zombie stereotypes we decided to call them about women as better stewards and things like that. So today we're going to try to address those a little bit. And the main issue here is that policy built on myths doesn't really help us break out of this low productivity trap and these gender inequalities. We really have to start getting at the real underlying causes of gender inequalities to really break free from these. So today, we really want to start getting beyond some of those unsubstantiated claims or myths about gender in agriculture and climate change. And some of the issues or the dangers of relying on such myths or unsubstantiated claims are that, we don't want to rely on those kinds of evidence or that lack of evidence for policy. Anyway, my slides keep moving, and I'm not sure why, but I'm not pushing. Anyway, is there a button? Anyway, today the idea here are the objectives. We want to reconsider some of the myths related to gender and really look at the evidence related to the topics and get at the truths. It's not that they're just myths. There are some truths behind those myths. So really understanding what the truths are, what the evidence really says, and then explore how that's relevant for policy. So that's the main objectives for the day. So just to get started, we'll just jump into the first myth. Here's one. Women produce 60 to 80% of our food. And this is likely based on some of these statistics about the labor population. So if we look at economically active women in developing countries, we see that almost 80%, 79% report agriculture as their primary economic activity. And worldwide, it's about 50%, so 48%, I think is the exact. But that doesn't really tell us how much women contribute to the output, the agricultural production, the crop production. It's also important to think about what we're looking at. So in that last slide, we were just focusing on women. And then, if I went back, here we go, on this one. If we compare men and women, we see that women make up about 42% of the overall economically active population in agriculture. we have to be careful if we're comparing among women, if we're comparing between men and women when we're talking about gender. That's always an important distinction to make. But that didn't really tell us how much output, right, men and women were each producing. Some others have looked at, and I should say a lot of these graphs and things are coming from some work Cheryl Doss did in a 2011 report. But the other way to look at women's contribution to farm output is to look at how much of the food is produced either by female-headed households or by plots owned or managed by women. And here you have some different figures. You see that if we look at female-headed household, it ranges from 2% in a case in China all the way to 17% in Nicaragua. I'm really sorry about these slides jumping around. Okay, there we go. But I think it's dangerous just to think about female-headed households when we're talking about gender, because the majority of women live in male-headed households. So we're really taking a very unique set of the population when we look at female-headed households. So another way they've explored this is looking at plots owned and managed by women, and you get some similar statistics, but they're different. And you notice it's a wide range. But again, this isn't telling us that exact statistic that was stated in the myth, how much of the food production is really produced by women. And actually, Cheryl Doss says in this article that it's really impossible to attribute how much contribution women are making to food production. If anybody's cooked with their family, you could even start to get the idea of how hard this would be. Can you even at a dinner or over a week of time, could you imagine calculating how much you produce versus your husband or your spouse? It's just really hard, and then taking that over a whole agricultural system is just impossible. So that's a zombie statistic, that's 60 to 80%. It's just a number, but there's some truth behind that. The truth is that women do contribute a lot to agricultural production. In some case studies, we see that about time use, we see that women across Africa and Asia in some various case studies have spent up to 60%, or their share of the total agricultural labor is up to 60% of that time. So we know that women are contributing a lot to agricultural production. So that's the truth behind the myth, but it's really hard to put an exact number or statistic behind that. And then I just briefly wanted to also show this. There's this case study that Beth B. did in Mexico, where she really tied women's contribution to the gender division of labor and showed how that impacted food security issues. And the idea is that oftentimes weeding is considered women's work, and women do a lot of the weeding in agricultural production in different agricultural systems around the world. And she found that during this weeding process, women were collecting edible plants that provided food security for the family, or food for household consumption. And we've seen this example in other parts of the world, as illustrated here in these pictures. So what's the implication? Well, I think the main implication here is that we have to recognize women as farmers, not just go with our typical stereotype that men are the farmers in the world, but we have to recognize women as farmers. And I think this would be the first step in overcoming some of these inequalities in access to agricultural inputs and resources. And this was just an example from Ethiopia that showed some of those differences in access to services. And then if we look at the second myth that I wanted to talk about here is that every time during this literature, I don't know how many times I've read this at the beginning of a paper. And I'm not saying that it's the idea behind the myth isn't right, but the statistic and this kind of stereotype behind it is that the poor are among the most vulnerable to climate change. And since women make up 70% of the poor, then they're the most vulnerable. It's used a lot, and as I said, there's some truth behind it, but we have to dig a little deeper to understand what those inequalities are. So I think the rationale, or the truth behind this myth has to do with that the poor have fewer resources to draw on when coping with climate change. They often have less diversified farms because the smaller your farm is, the harder it is to really diversify and be able to produce different crops that are more resilient to different types of climatic events, or so that you would have a range of those products. A lot of times rural households rely heavily on natural resources such as firewood and water, and those are often also related to the gender division of labor, and in many cases around the world, not all, but many, collecting water and firewood are under women's responsibility in the household division of labor. But as I mentioned, this really draws on another zombie statistic. There's not much evidence to support that 70% of the world's poor are women. Several scholars have interrogated that statistic. And there's a stereotype there too that women are vulnerable. And more vulnerable than men. That's not stated, but it's kind of implied in that statement. So, as I mentioned, several studies have already interrogated this idea that 70% of the world poor are women. Sylvia Chant, Cecile Jackson, and Seema Aurora Johnson have all looked into this issue a little bit. This myth also portrays women as either victims or this one portrays women as victims. Jackie's going to get into the other side of that dichotomy a little bit later in the presentation. But we don't hear much about men being victims or saviors, but we hear this about women. And so why do we hear this kind of discourse that's an either-or situation and not looking at the range or looking at kind of the inequalities behind that and what's driving that? And the reality the kind of what we want to get at behind this myth is that men and women have different vulnerabilities to climate change, and these are dependent on gender norms related to the gender division of labor, access and control over resources, and decision-making power. So we have to start getting at some of those underlying issues to break some of these inequalities. And just to give a couple of examples about the inconsistent results we see about vulnerability, we have two cases about hurricanes and flooding, one in Bangladesh from the early 90s, where we saw that more women than men died in this natural disaster. And some of the reasoning mentioned about this were related to gender norms. Women didn't typically learn to swim, so they weren't able to get away that way. They have limited mobility, they felt that the shelters were unsafe, so they weren't, going to the shelters right away. And they also have this care responsibility where they're caring for the elderly and the sick in their homes, and if those people were unable to go to the shelters, the women caring for them probably weren't going to go to the shelters either. And so these are things based on gender norms, right? But then if we look at the Nicaragua case of Hurricane Mitch in 98, I believe, we see that more men than women died. And this was attributed to the fact that men were more likely to participate in search and rescue missions and take on risky behaviors. And that's, again, a gender norm, that men take on more risky behaviors than women. So I think this illustrates how this type of vulnerability is related to gender norms. Okay, and that was kind of a more broad example, so I wanted to also find an agricultural example to show you. And this one is more based on women's wages or income generating potential. And so this author looked at agricultural wage gaps across India and found, it was looking to see if there was a relationship between rain shocks and gender wage gaps. And they found that overall there wasn't an impact. There was no direct correlation between rain shocks and agricultural wage gaps. However, when they focused in on a rain-fed rice-producing region, they found that rain shocks had a great impact on the wage gap, where women lost out on, were more likely to lose their income. And this is because women play a greater role in crops such as rice that are heavily reliant on rain. And so when there was a negative rain shock, when there was less rain, the women were likely to lose their jobs in these production systems. And so this widened the gender wage gap. And so this is another example of how women can be more vulnerable to climate change. So I think the implications here are that we really need a better, less fragmented data to understand the patterns behind these inconsistencies in the data results and the results that we're finding. And that really vulnerability is not related to biological sex, but rather to gender norms, which are an expression of power differentials. And now I'm going to turn it over to Jackie.
Just to say that Jennifer and I and some of our colleagues are involved in a massive literature review. We're in the middle of it. And if you go back to the 80s and the 90s, you see studies that are being echoed again now in the 2000s. That this field doesn't seem to be moving forward. Right? There's something missing here. We're lacking traction in this field. You'll hear me talk, as Jennifer has done, about contradictions in the data. So you do feel like you're a little bit like you're in the land of the walking dead. There are all these studies. Some of them say the same thing, some of them contradict each other. We don't seem to be moving forward. So that's one of the big questions that I think we need to be looking at as we talk today and as we hear the case studies that are going to come after this talk. So the two myths covered by Jennifer rely particularly on zombie statistics, and the couple that I'm going to cover really refer to zombie stereotypes or assumptions about the differences between men and women that are misleading, so that root causes are misdiagnosed and then policy misses its mark. So if I can have the next slide, please. So if we look at this idea that women are better stewards of natural resources, which is something that crops up fairly frequently in the preamble to sort of policy documents, there are a couple of points in terms of the rationale. Women depend more on natural resources, so they're expected to take better care of them. And women are more disposed to collaborate, so that the collective action, if they're involved in it, collective action that's needed for adaptation or mitigation will be more likely to succeed. Next slide, please. So again, our review throws up contradictory evidence as illustrated by these examples. And as we'll, I think, reiterate throughout the rest, earlier Jennifer was making this point and I'll reiterate it through the rest of the talk. Why are we getting these contradictions? Well, one of them is that women, in quotes, don't have a single unified interest. That women's interest in the stewardship of natural resources is just as subject to social differences or is shaped as much by social class, by wealth, by power, as are the interests of men. This seems like a very simple point, but it's a hard one to get across, that there's this essential interaction between gender and social class, and so that it doesn't really help the field, and it certainly doesn't help in policy, to talk about women as if they were a single unified interest group. They're not. Next slide, please. The other aspect of the myth is about participation. If we have women involved in groups, they'll be more likely to succeed. And again, there's basically no consistent evidence that supports this claim. Next slide, please. So if policymakers want to benefit women farming under climate change, we need to get rid of this notion that there's something intrinsically or inherently about being a woman that makes you more likely to be a successful climate-smart farmer. And we need to aim for much more precise and more sophisticated targeting of different social groups. And recognize that participation of women as a generic term is not enough if these underlying social differences are not addressed. So the point here is much more precise socioeconomic targeting needed. Next slide, please. The next and final myth that we want to address is that technology is a powerful instrument for closing the gender gap in agriculture. Next slide, please. The rationale for this is because there are now a lot of economic studies that show that the productivity gap, the gender productivity gap, can be effectively eliminated so long as we make sure that there's equal access to technologies and inputs. And this notion of the power of technology also engenders a lot of attention to women-friendly technologies that tend to focus on solving practical needs like nutrition or relieving the collection of firewood, but don't deal with the underlying social problems that are fundamentally you have to deal with, what are called the strategic needs. So next slide, please. So the root issue here is the issue of control and how gender norms define, the rules of the game in terms of control over strategic assets, as this case illustrates. Many of you have probably seen this case before. It's often quoted, and there are a lot of studies in which this same story reoccurs. There's new technology introduced, women's labor input increases as a result of the intensification, but the choice about what to grow is controlled by men. In this case, the women were left cultivating minor vegetables. They worked harder on the higher value crops. The men got control over the sales, and so women were working harder to produce income over which they had very little control. What struck me when I reread this case is that, in my mind, at least when I first went back to it, the problem was the technology. And I think this is often used this case is used to critique that the technology was inappropriate. But what really stands out in this case is the decision over crop choice, and that the gender norms that, as I said, structured the rules of the game in this particular case were really the underlying factor that led to the distribution of benefits from this particular technology. And our working hypothesis, I suppose you could call it here, of why we're seeing these contradictory examples of one technology leading to good, positive outcomes, and then a very similar technology leading to perverse outcomes, is because the gender norms in these situations are different. But we're not looking at that in these studies. Right? It's as if we're comparing two plant types and we know nothing about the DNA. So the gender norms are like the DNA of the social world, and we're not looking at it. Next slide, please. Basically, if we want to sort of get over this myth, and as Jennifer said, it's a myth all myths have some truth in it. If we want to get over this notion that technology is the entry point for closing the gender gap in agriculture, I think it's very important, particularly from a policy point of view, that we bear in mind that when there are gender differences in adoption of technology, this is often a symptom of other deeper-rooted problems. That it's important, of course, to pay attention to equality of access, but this has to be complemented with attention to the underlying DNA of the situation, the underlying gender norms. Next slide, please. I think we'll just go to the next slide. So we wanted to conclude by just summarizing a few principles that are leaping out from what is a frustrating morass of contradictory evidence at the moment. Next slide, please. And we've identified a few principles. These are points that can be taken into account in terms of moving from these broad, rather mythic stereotypes to a much more precise characterization of what gender inequality means. But next slide, please. It's clear, it's clear from our analysis to this point that the different issues that we've raised need to be put together in a single intervention. It's no good just fixing access if you don't deal with the issue of control. And then next slide, please. The two big points that we want to bring out in terms of what is next is, as I've said, this is a field that is morassed in a lot of little studies, a lot of case studies, a lot of contradictory evidence. We need to elevate the game in terms of the kind of research that we're doing. We need to get beyond this sort of repeating the same kind of study over and over and move to a different scale of research. Gender inequality is a bit like the common cold. You know, everybody's liable to catch it, and it is certainly as ubiquitous. If we knew we had a cure for the common cold, we would be running large-scale clinical trials to really establish what works and what doesn't. And that is what we have not yet succeeded in doing in this field. And so we need to move to a different scale in this game. The big positive thing is there's a cure. Okay? If we deal with gender norms, we are convinced that this is not a firewall against changing the situation of gender inequality. It's a very positive prospect because gender norms can change. They're dynamic. But we do need to move not only to a larger scale of research, but a sort of action research approach where policy and research come together. I've called it here, or we've called it here, large-scale policy experimentation. We'd like to encourage the people in this field and those of you who work with these kinds of issues to start thinking on a much bigger scale and to look for ways to build these kinds of policy-level experiments so that we can get to the cure for gender equality. Thanks for your attention.